This video will get you familiar with Svelte Kit in under 20 minutes by covering things you'll be doing majority of the time, so you can get started building your projects with it right ahead. We'll start by creating a new Svelte Kit project. Select skeleton project, and we don't need type checking and testing. Install the dependencies and start the dev server. To get the styling out of the way, I will use Pico CSS. It will handle the basic styling. You can skip it, it's completely optional. So let's see what we have here. Majority of the time you'll be working inside this routes folder. As you can guess, it will contain all the routes and pages your website is going to have. Try to edit the only file we have here. You can see it represents the root page. All framework specific files are prefixed with a plus. What we just edited is the plus page.svelte file. It's like the index.html of a route. It will be served to the browser when its routes receives a request. Next up we have plus page.js file. Its main job is providing data to your page. All we have to do is export a load function that will fetch the data required by its particular route. And that data will be available to the plus page.svelte file of that route. And we can use that data using the templating syntax Svelte provides. So let's see this in action by creating one for the root route. We'll fetch dummy post from the JSON placeholder API and return the same. In our Svelte file, export the data prop. Using the each block, we'll loop over the array of posts. And for each post, link the full post using its ID and display its title and body. If you look at the response, you can see we have post ID, title and body. But what if you don't want to load your post on the client? Instead, you want to directly load it from the database. In that case, you have page.server.js. It is almost similar to page.js, but emphasis on the server since it can only run on the server. You can access your database instance and load your posts from here. Let's implement a use case for our site. We'll create a route for the post. Post ID will be its slug. Assume the getPost is a database helper function that will guess at the particular post from its ID. We can access the post ID slug from params. I will quickly implement this function with the JSON placeholder API. Just like with page.js, the post data will be available in the data prop. Let's just quickly lay out the post. The route should be live now. Hit refresh. Let's check others too. Apart from just loading data, since it is server only, it can also handle form submissions, and that too without any client-side JavaScript. You export some actions that accept their respective form submissions like create post, and then you specify which action would the form submit to. You can then access the submitted data using request.form_data and access the individual fields by their name using the get method and do what you want with it. Let's implement the create post page for our blog. We'll need the title and the body. You would have noticed we didn't specify an action for our form. That's because if you don't specify an action, it would by default submit to a default action. Assume the create post is a database helper function. It will accept a title, body, and the user who created it. Let's just also implement this with the JSON placeholder API. You can access the response from our action using the form prop. It would be a JSON response. It'll just quickly show it on the page. You'll notice when you submit it, it's reloading the entire page, because that's how form submissions work if you don't use JavaScript to handle it. Svelte Kit also provides form enhancements to enable JavaScript. They are fairly easy to use but not in the scope of this video. Let's go ahead with our next file, which is server.js. Notice the naming. is only for the server and has nothing to do with the page, because it is used to create an API endpoint. You export these functions named after HTTP verbs like get, post, put, etc. and they'll handle their corresponding request type. I have taken a not so common example of logging out using a form submission to the endpoint. Let's create this logout endpoint for our blog. Add a dummy implementation and throw a redirect to the login page. Now all we need is a login button, but first let's just add a nav bar for our routes. At last, add our logout form. Try to log out now. It's redirecting correctly, and this undefined is because we don't have a login route, so it's just defaulting to the post route. The logout endpoint is called successfully, as you can see. Our next problem is that we want to show our navbar on every page, not just the home, and that's what the layout.svelte file allows us to do. It's like a wrapper for the pages that fall under it. It usually contains the elements that should be available on each of those pages, like this navbar in the root layout that will be available in each of these pages since they fall under the root route. Now we know how to make our navbar available on every page of our blog. Create a layout in the root and bring the navbar here. This slot element represents the content of all the pages that falls under this route. I'll wrap it with main with class container, and that's basically it. Similar to the pages, layouts too have their corresponding JavaScript files, layout.js and layout.server.js, and they are pretty much similar to page.js and page.server.js files. They load data for the layout, and since the data is available to the layout, it is also available to the pages that fall under that layout. For example, we might need the logged in user info on most of the pages. It's best to load the user's data from the layout and access it across the pages. We don't have any login functionality, so let's return a dummy user data from the layout. Now we'll display the user avatar on our navbar. On our home page, instead of stating the obvious, we'll just welcome the user. You might have noticed the user data object kind of merged with our post data, because behind the scenes Svelte Kit is handling the merger of all the data that is provided to the page. In case of conflicting names, it will prioritize the closest load function. That will always be the page's own load function. This would have been it, but one of the major gotchas I have had coming from React World is this lib folder, so I thought to include it in this video, which is actually a special folder and Svelte way of handling your components, utility functions, etc. Like this button component, you'll need it on most of the pages on your site. But the way you import is with the $sign followed by the absolute path to the component. In my experience, if you aren't using TypeScript and try to use auto import in VS Code, it's going to use a relative path instead, which then will result in an error. Another special thing that we have is this server folder inside the lib. Everything inside the folder will only be available to your server-only files like the page.server and server.js. Svelte Kit will make sure you don't accidentally import it into a client-facing page or file. So let's demonstrate this. First, we'll add a button component. Next, we'll need those database helper functions which by nature are sensitive and should be server only. Let's bring over those here. Now if I try to import these functions to a client-facing file, it will not allow me to do that, and that is very helpful in cases where you accidentally auto-import something from server with a similar name. Let me clear that. And that is finally it. Now you should be ready to go and build your next project with Svelte Kit. If you found this helpful, let me know by leaving a like and subscribe for more content like this.